My name is Rachel and I'm going to be your guide this evening for our Ghost Walks tour. We'll hear stories of murder, mystery, and mayhem. This may not be your typical Ghost Walks tour. You'll hear 5 stories tonight. Most of the characters that you'll meet are portraying real people from Benton County history, and all of the stories are true. And as we walk along downtown, I'll point out a few historic buildings for you to notice along the way. First off, to start, we have behind us the Federal Post Office building, which was finished in 1919. It later became the Rogers Public Library, and then eventually it was used by the Rogers Historical Museum. Today it sits empty. Across the street, you'll see as we get up to the corner, you've probably seen this building before, the Old Lane Hotel, which was built in the late 1920s. Had some famous movie stars and celebrities stay there, like Errol Flynn, the boxer Jack Dempsey, and even Amelia Earhart. We're gonna walk down to the corner and turn towards the post office, and we're going to meet a man named B.F. Sykes. And he was one of the early founders of Rogers in the 1880s. And he has a rather tragic story to tell us about the murder of his son-in-law, Constable Will Dalton. So if you follow me, we'll head down and meet him. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Come on, gather in. Don't let me go to you. Well, my name is Sykes, Benjamin Franklin Sykes. Oh, most folks around here just call me Frank. I've been asked to share with you tonight the tragic story of our son-in-law, Will Dalton. Yeah, that was an event that was hard not only on our family, but on the entire community at the time. But now, before I tell you the story, let me give you just a tiny bit of background. In September of '88, our youngest, Elmira Ann, married Will Dalton. Will was the constable of the Escalapia Township, which lies just southeast of here, about 5 miles. Now, Will and Elmira Ann had 2 children. Jimmy, who was born in '89, and young Will, who was born on December the 31st of 1890. Now, what happened was this. In January of '91, A.W. Vandergrift, who was the sheriff up in Berry County, Missouri, just up across the line, tracked 2 desperate characters named Nen and Harry Shepard down into Benton County. Now, most folks figured probably they was holed up out at the McCulloch place, which lies about 5 miles southeast of here, again on Escalapia Hollow Road. And that was because Miss McCulloch was the shepherd's sister. Now, I stood right up in the middle of Arkansas Street, just across the railroad tracks, on the bitterly cold morning of January the 20th, 1891. And I watched Will, Jesse McFarland, who was the town marshal, Vandergrift, and a young fellow named Ed Wright, who was the night watchman up in Pierce City, Missouri, ride off out toward the McCulloch place. Well, now, according to what Jesse told me later, when they got out there, they knew that they were in the right spot because they heard Mrs. McCullough say, "Look out, boys, there's here and you know what's a-coming." Well, they split up. Vandergriff and the night watchman went around behind the house to watch back there. Will and Jesse went up front. Will walked up on the porch, finding the front door open, unlocked. He just opened it. All he got out of his mouth was "boys" before he was hit by a slug from a Winchester. He staggered off the porch, down the walkway, and fell dead from his wounds down by the gate. The shepherds skedaddled out back, heading for the barn and their horses, and in the hail of gunfire that ensued, the night watchman was wounded in the hip. Well, the shepherds made it to the barn, got on their horses, and hightailed it. The lawmen came back into town. They formed up a posse, a few of them to go back out to the McCullough place and recover Will's body. The rest of them to go after the shepherds. Now they figured probably that they were going to try to make their getaway on the train. So they boarded the evening northbound freight. Well, sure enough, when the train got up near Garfield, which is just northeast of here, there's a big sharp curve up there in the tracks. And the train has to slow down to get around that. And there were the shepherds. They boarded the train only to be met by the lawman's guns. Then he surrendered. Harry made a break for him. His body was found the next morning by the southbound, dead along the tracks from his gunshot wounds. Well, Nen was brought back to town, tried, sentenced to the state penitentiary. Rumor had it that he was killed trying to make an escape, but that his body was lost in the river and never seen again. So, our Will was gone, leaving behind a 19-year-old widow with two young boys, the youngest of which was quite 3 weeks old yet.
Oh, goodness.
Of course, Harry was dead. The night watchman, he died 2 days later on the 22nd from his wounds. So there was 3, almost certainly 4 young men gone before their time. Although there were some folks that said they saw Nen around town years later. There was ever any real evidence of that. And you know, the sad thing about it is, I was told that had the shepherds surrendered, chances are they would have been released because they were wanted on a warrant from Missouri, not one from Arkansas.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the story. I hope you folks enjoy the rest of your tours.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sykes. Appreciate it. All right, we're gonna head down the street this way, where it's maybe a little quieter, and I'll tell you a little more when we get there. So let's cross the street. heard the unfortunate story of poor Will Dalton. We're going to hear a few more stories. I did want to point out the building across the street, the old Union Aid building. It's actually designed by an architect that did a lot of buildings in downtown Rogers, named A.O. Clark. So if you walk down First Street, you'll probably see a few of the buildings that architect designed. The house here behind me was built around the time that this next story occurred. And so we're gonna walk down to the corner and we're looking for Mr. C.L. Hart, who was the administrator of the estate in what was a very tragic family incident. So let's head down to the Mr. C.L. Hart.
I don't know. It's quite concerning.
It is concerning. So it looks like we're missing Mr. C.L. Hart, but I seem to have a message here from him. It's a letter. Ah, yes. Okay. The Duckworth family. So Mr. C.L. Hart was the administrator of the estate after this horrible incident, and I will read to you what he wrote about it. He says, "Poor little Anna Duckworth returned home from Sunday school on March 29, 1896, to a terrible scene. Her parents were lying dead, and her little sister was gravely wounded. It appears that Pulaski Duckworth, in a fit of insanity, hit his wife, Belle, and 5-year-old daughter, Grace, in the head with an axe, before killing himself with a razor. Mr. Duckworth was a prosperous farmer, but neighbors reported he had been acting strangely in recent months and seemed despondent over poor health. But no one expected he was capable of something this terrible. Anna, who was only 7 years old, ran to alert a neighbor. They hurried to the scene and did everything they could to help Grace, but she was too severely injured and died a few hours later. All three were laid to rest in a single grave in Hart Cemetery. Anna would be cared for by her grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. W.G. Williams in the Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, until 1903, when she married Stephen Page at the age of 14. They lived in Sebastian County and then California. Anna died in 1976 after living with the memory of this terrible crime for 80 years. An awful story, isn't it?
I would say.
I can understand that Mr. C.L. Hart was busy taking care of matters, too busy to come see us. We'll leave that for the next group. Now we'll continue across the street and head down 3rd Street. Alright, so we still have 3 more stories to hear. I did want to point out the building right here behind us. It was actually built as a Masonic lodge. It was also a youth center, and now it is the museum storage for the collections. There's another Victorian home up here behind me. You see the lights on inside. That was built in 1899. And later was actually bought by a local radio personality who ran a tea room out of the house called Magnolia House. So it is sometimes still referred to as the Magnolia House. So we'll walk from here down to the corner. You'll see that great house decorated for Halloween. We'll turn the corner and we are looking for Mr. Marshall Hill, who is going to tell us about a recent family feud that he had to deal with. So let's go find him.
Y'all staying warm tonight?
Yep.
Yes. All right. My name's Marshall Hill. I'm law enforcement in this area. It's a little bit cool tonight, so old man with a good blanket's happy. Typical fashion of law enforcement, I'm just standing around waiting for something to happen, looking pretty. I can't do the pretty part very well, but I can stand around very well. What story I'm going to tell you happened in 1894. Was anybody around during that time? Just making sure.
Just shy.
Is anybody from the Armstrong family from Silent Springs? Good, because I'm going to tell you an ugly story about that family, and I don't want to offend anybody. The story is about James and Lee Armstrong from Silent Springs. There are two brothers. James was a blacksmith, and Lee was a carpenter. They lived in a house just off of Main Street in Silent Springs. On Tuesday, James went to the territory and got married. He brought his young bride back to Silent Springs, to the home that him and Lee shared in Silent Springs. And, typical 1894 fashion, they wanted to celebrate the new wedding, so they sent one of their small children down to get a jug of whiskey to bring back for them. Child came back with a jug of whiskey, and they commenced to having a good time and celebrating the new member of the family. Well, has anybody heard nothing good happens after midnight? My mom used to tell me that all the time, and I never listened. About 3 o'clock Wednesday morning, Lee, being the older brother, told his younger brother, James, it's time to go to bed, go be with your new bride, more or less, and you need to go sleep it off. Well, Lee, being the strong-willed younger brother, told his older brother, no, I'm not ready to go to bed. Anybody ever had that problem with their siblings? No. So the argument commenced and carried on. Things got a little heated. Lee told James again, go to bed. James said no and pulled out a pocket knife. And Lee says, no, you need to put that away and just calm down. We'll, talk about it tomorrow. James took a step towards Lee. Lee picked up a shotgun and told his little brother, no, go to sleep. You don't need to be doing this. Well, James didn't listen and lunged at him with a pocket knife. I don't know how drunk you have to be to go after a man with a double-barrel shotgun with a pocket knife, but apparently you have to be pretty drunk. So he lunged at him. Lee shot him twice in the chest with a double-barrel shotgun. Killed him dead. Then I got the message. I had to go from Bentonville and ride my horse all the way to Silent Springs to arrest Lee and bring him back and put him in jail. The sad part of it is, nobody knows what happened to that young bride. She took off back to the Indian territory and nobody's heard from her since. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your tour.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sounds like that escalated pretty quickly.
Very
I'd
quick.
say.
Never done.
So I can tell you about another family feud that wasn't quite as deadly as that one. We're standing here on Cherry Street. You can see 2nd Street here, 3rd Street down there. So Mr. B.F. Sykes, the man who we met at the first stop, you remember, both him and his brother, J. Wade Sykes, were involved in the early planning of Rogers. So one of them owned land north of Cherry Street, and the other owned land south of Cherry Street. So I guess they couldn't decide on where to put those roads, because if you see, 2nd Street has a little jog, so does 3rd Street and 4th Street. So I wish they could have figured that out, because we're still paying for it now. But we're gonna go up to the garden here at the Hawkins house. There's a lady who has a story to tell about a murder that occurred. She didn't see it, but it happened right in front of her neighbor's house, Mrs. Ida Havens. I don't know if they get along, but we'll hear about the story and what happened there. So let's go talk to her.
Good evening. Allow me to tell you all a tale of a tragic and senseless incident that shook the town of Sulfur Springs and was one that we did not soon forget. It happened one Sunday evening in November of 1895, just a few miles west of Sulfur Springs, right outside the home of Mrs. Ida Havens, which was known to be a place of ill repute. Mr. Fred Crocker was on his way home to Sulfur Springs after spending the day up in Southwest City, Missouri, when he was passing by the Havens house as two men exited. Those two men were Al Liddick and Cap Franks, both from Southwest City, although they were not upstanding citizens. They exited the house arguing, and they were drunk and then they spotted Fred. Cap Franks, who was the deputy marshal of Southwest City, then pulled his gun and fired 2 shots, with one of the bullets hitting Fred right in the throat, breaking his neck and killing him. In all the commotion, the horses were spooked and ran off, and they jilted poor Mr. Crocker out of the buggy and tore it up in the process. Liddick and Franks escaped, and Sheriff Galbraith was called. Unfortunately, he was indisposed in a murder trial, so he sent his deputy Wiley Orr to find the men, and a posse was formed. Now another group was formed too, to find the body of Fred Crocker and his horses, and thankfully they were, and all were returned to Sulfur Springs and the Crocker family. Liddick and Franks were a little harder to find, however, so us folks in Sulfur Springs, we set up a reward of $200 for their capture. Now we mustn't forget about Mrs. Ida Havens in all of this. The murder did happen right outside her home, of course. Well, it turns out Ida saw the whole thing happen as well, and so did her 6 little ones who were at home with her that night. Being the only witnesses, the sheriff took them in and asked citizens to give them any aid they could, as the poor family was destitute. Such a sad, sad case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thank you.
Thank you for telling us your story. Let's continue on down to the corner here. One more story to hear this evening. I hope you're enjoying yourselves. We're here in front of the Hawkins house, which was built in 1895. The same family lived here from 1900 until it was given to the Rogers Historical Museum in 1975. Quite a long time. And we're going to meet a lady who wishes to remain anonymous, but I understand she knows the story of a young railroad worker who lived in Bentonville. Apparently he met his untimely end in a very unexpected way. So we're going to hear what she has to say about that.
Good evening. Good evening. I do like your attire for the evening. Very nice. Very nice. Well, I'm going to tell you a story tonight that happened long ago. 1891 was the year. The day was actually August 22nd. And that's important to note in our story because August 22nd is usually considered about the end of summer and the start of fall. But it also marks the beginning of the apple crop harvest. This was a great apple producing area. So keep that in mind because that's a critical part of our story. My neighbor, Thomas Andrews, was just 36 years old when he died that night in a tragic accident. Now, Thomas and his wife and 3 children had lived in Bentonville. You know, Bentonville is just about 5 miles to our northwest. And he was working there for about 4 years for a railroad company. His job was to clear the right-of-way for new tracks to be laid for a line that was going to run from Kansas City down to Bentonville. And it was very hard work. It was clearing the land with hand tools, basically. And Thomas was looking around probably all the time for a job that might be a little bit less taxing on his body. Now, he and his wife and family lived on Southeast 3rd Street in Bentonville. just sort of close to the heart of the downtown area. And interestingly enough, directly across the street from his house was the Bentonville Commercial Evaporator. Now, you may not even know what I'm talking about there, so I'm going to tell you. An evaporator was a place where all that fruit I was talking about, all the apple harvest, is brought in to be processed so it could be shipped. Now, remember, in 1891, that newfangled refrigeration business hadn't happened yet. So in order to make sure your apples didn't rot on the train, you had to take the moisture out of them. And that's what an evaporator did. I think today you people would call it a dehydrator, same idea. It's not a new process at all. People had been evaporating and dehydrating fruits and vegetables for centuries. I mean, you think back to the very first, the grapes being turned into raisins centuries ago. So people knew how to take care of their produce to make it last. Now, this worked pretty easily if you happen to have just a small operation. For example, if on my little house right here I had a few apple trees, I could take care of all of my own preservation. I would take the apples and cut them up, and I'd lay them out on an old screen and cover them with some cheesecloth so the flies wouldn't get all over them, and then I would let the sun do all of the work for me. But if I happened to own an orchard where there were wagon loads of apples coming off my trees every single day, I needed to have a better way to do that. So that's why the towns in the area decided they could build commercial evaporators. So farmers would bring their apples into town, and this was right across the street from where Thomas Andrews lived. Now let's pretend you're an apple. What happens to you when you come to the evaporator? Well, the first thing is your core gets taken out, then you get peeled, then you get sliced in nice, wonderful, even slices so you look like a bunch of donuts. You're sprinkled with a little sulfur powder so that you don't turn brown in the process of evaporating. And then you're laid out on different kinds of trays or boxes with slats in, and then you go into the evaporator building itself. Now, this was a building that was probably about 2 stories tall. The bottom floor held a source of heat. It was either a furnace or a kiln or a fireplace, I guess, but it tried to keep the heat at a constant temperature. Now, everybody here knows what does heat do? It rises up. So about 12 feet up would be the floor number 2. And instead of a solid ceiling on your floor, there would be slats and channels or little shafts where the heat could go up, and the apples then were taken up to that second floor and put on racks. They're in some kind of a tray, and they're put on racks. So there needed to be workers that fed the fire at the lower level, and workers that were on the upper level whose job it was to turn the apples and shift them around so that they would dry, take the moisture out. Now, I'm not exactly sure how long it took one tray of apples to dry, but I do know that when the Bentonville Commercial Evaporator was built in 1881, it boasted of being able to process 800 bushels of apples in a single day. That's a lot of apples. So it must not have taken a real long time. Well, I should mention too, in case you didn't know it, this area of Benton County was known almost worldwide for apple production. In fact, there were a couple of years, sometime between 1890 and 1920, when Benton County, Arkansas had the most prolific yield of apples per acre in the entire United States of America. And so when the trains came in, this allowed our farmers to be able to ship apples everywhere because they could get them dried and packed, and they could they could take off and be shipped to Boston or California, either one. Well, now Thomas, he's tired of working the land trying to make a railroad track. And one night when he came home, he said, you know what, I think I'm just going to go over to that evaporator and see what kind of work they do over there. Because they worked around the clock. So there was 24 hours a day during the heat of the height of the harvest, there were people working. So he wandered over there, but it was about this time of night, and it wasn't real light out. And back in 1891, I just need to remind you, there was no electricity either. So he may have had a little light, or maybe he was smoking a cigar and had his matches out or whatever. But he wandered into the evaporator and he looked around downstairs to see what happened and what the workers did. And then he wandered upstairs and he looked around and checked out how the trays were being dried. And he said to himself, you know, I think this is a job I could do. In fact, he got pretty excited about it, and he was whistling and thinking, oh man, I could have a new career here. I'm going to go downstairs and I'm going to check in with the foreman and see if there's a job I can get. So he started down the stairs, but guess what? He made a really big mistake. It was not the stairs he stepped into. It was an elevator shaft. And so Thomas dropped 12 feet down. Now, 12 feet may not be that far, but there was one huge problem. Across the elevator shaft was a 2x4. And it may have been a piece of bracing for the shaft, or it may have just been something that was there loose. But who knows? Thomas never saw it. And as his body dropped through that shaft, well, there was only one point of his body that connected with that 2x4, so the full force and full weight of his body landed on his chin. Boom! And what that did was it snapped his neck back, and Thomas was dead just like that. He never knew what hit him, literally. Now, can you imagine the surprise of the fellows that were working down below? And their job was just to keep the fire going, and all of a sudden, a dead body drops right down in their midst. Well, they called the doctor, and the doctor rushed over, but Thomas was long dead. There was nothing that could be done for him. They were a little bit worried that maybe there had been some foul play up there. Maybe someone pushed him, so they had the coroner do an inquest. But nothing turned up. It was just a complete sad accident. And it was very sad because Thomas left a widow and 3 children, and they really didn't have any means to support themselves, but fortunately, the town of Bentonville rallied around them and helped take care of them till they could get back on their feet. So that's the sad story about Thomas Andrews and how he fell accidentally down an elevator shaft at the Bentonville Commercial Evaporator. And if there's a lesson to be learned, I will tell you to be careful tonight as you're walking around in the dark. And you make sure that when your foot steps, you know what it's going to land on before you take off. Thank you for coming tonight and hearing our stories.
Very good. Thank you. That was awesome. Well, not awesome, but you know what I mean.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for coming out this evening for our ghost walks with the Rogers Historical Museum. We want to thank the characters that were portrayed tonight. Thank you to Nancy Swearingen, John Ford, Ashley Sayers, and Dan Barrett. And with the advice of our kind friend here, please be careful tonight as you go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really well done.
Very good.